So you've decided to run 42.2 kilometers worth of pain. Don't worry, you're not the only crazy one. But sometimes it's very difficult to know where to start and where we get that information that's going to push us along towards the marathon finish line. In this video, we're going to talk all things marathon. I'm going to profile the marathon and tell you the information that you need to know to get you on the way to running that 42-kilometer journey. And it all starts right now, baby. Firstly, welcome back to the TRIAX Performance channel. My name is Rob Delves, and I form 1/3 of the TRIAX Performance team, along with Damo and Sean. You can contact me on Twitter at DelvesRobert, and also on the TRIAX Instagram page at TRIAX Performance. You can also contact any members of the TRIAX Performance team on our social media accounts or via our website. I'd also like to encourage you to consider subscribing to the channel and help by liking some of our videos. So if you get anything out of the content, then feel free to consider supporting us. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back. A bit of context into this video series. This series will basically focus upon the marathon, so looking at all things marathon in terms of training, physiology, principles, how to get better, how to perform better. So basically anything you can think of in terms of marathon performance, this edition of the channel will cover. I'm also running a bit of a marathon diary entry series as well. That's basically following my progress towards completion of my first marathon. I'm still in the very, very early stages of that, but if you'd like to follow that progress, you can also do that via this channel. But for now, let's get stuck into profiling the marathon and figuring out what you need to know before you start training for your very first marathon. So firstly, let's get stuck into profiling the 42.2 kilometer journey. Now, as we know, the marathon, it's the longest race in terms of Olympic distance, 42.2 kilometers, or I think that's about 26 miles in the imperial system. Sorry, I'm Australian. I don't really care about the imperial stuff. Metric statistics all the way for me. But we also know that the marathon's becoming increasingly popular with your weekend warriors or your recreational athletes like myself who want to complete one as maybe like a personal challenge or tick something off the bucket list or as part of a New Year's resolution. So when we look at marathon world records, how fast humans have actually completed the 42.2 kilometer distance, it's pretty daunting if you're a recreational athlete like myself. We know the women's world record is 2 hours, 14 minutes, and 4 seconds, which is absolutely unbelievable. Essentially, when we break that down, it's about 3-minute kilometers. Again, which is probably even more daunting considering the fact that I'd love to run 1 kilometer in about 3 minutes, let alone 42. So, you sort of just have to hold your breath a bit when you look at that. And then, so the men's world record as well. So there's been a lot of discussion and intention probably over the last 5 years about breaking that 2-hour marathon mark. In years gone by, we've had people that have broken the 4-minute mile and such, but the marathon, in terms of breaking the 2-hour mark, is just a little bit elusive at this stage. At the moment, the world record is 2 hours and 1 minute and 39 seconds, which is sub 3-minute kilometers, which again is just absolutely unbelievable. But when we look at that, that's for a recreational athlete, that's not something that we need to consider at this juncture. The most important factor we need to consider when we're training for a marathon or when we're about to train for a marathon and in that preparation stage is the training itself. Now, this can be pretty daunting, particularly if you're searching YouTube and you're trying to find some information that's relevant to you. Now, the best way I reckon to do a lot of things is to mimic somebody who's already done it or get information from someone who's already been there and then replicate it to your own process. So what I've done or what I've been doing over the past couple of weeks is collating some information on the marathon and in terms of training and some principles around that in order to actually base some training principles off. Now, the first process we need to go through when we're looking at marathons and completing marathons is identify a goal time for ourselves. Now, for instance, my long-term goal is to break a 3-hour marathon, but it's not something that I, in the short term, that I envisage actually happening, but it gives me something to work towards. So the first step that you need to do and need to accomplish is pick out your target time. Now, for some people, depending on your fitness base, that might be 5 hours, might be 4 hours, might be 3.5 hours, 3 hours, 2 hours, whatever it may be. So That's the first step we need to tick off. And then what we need to do is, well, now that we've figured out our marathon, our target marathon time, we then need to go, well, what sort of training do I actually need in order to get there? So what I've done and taken the liberty of doing is researched all the different major milestone times and have formulated some basic summary information which we can base our early training or base sort of our training goals to work towards. So over the past couple of weeks, I've compiled and done a lot of research over the internet in terms of books, research articles, journals on the marathon, and I've devised a bit of a summary table, which essentially shows us what we need to achieve or what we need to work towards in our training in order to give us the best chance of completing our target time. So in the table, I've listed basically 3 hours to 5 hours there. So anything I feel is probably attainable for the recreational athletes such as you and me. Essentially, what this table is, so if I can orientate you to the table, we've got target time there, volume. So volume, for people that aren't familiar with the vernacular, essentially is how much exercise you complete. So if you're in the gym, volume might be your sets and reps per exercise. But for runners, it's generally in terms of volume per session, so distances per session, and over the course of the week. What we also have is average pace. Now, average pace is essentially our race completion time divided by the total distance, which gives us a per kilometer reading there, as you can see. So, for instance, the 4 hour mark, I'd need to complete, or to reach the 4 hour mark, and for the marathon, I need to complete each kilometer in roughly 5 minutes and 42 seconds per kilometer. Essentially, that just gives us an indication of the average pace I need to obtain throughout the 42 kilometers. But I think all this table should be used as a bit of a guideline in terms of when you're planning your future training or when you're getting towards your preparation stage in your marathon training, that this is something you should probably refer to. So again, I'll use 4 hours as a bit of an example. So the volume, 40 to 60 kilometers per week. That's a bit of an indication there. You probably a lot of people probably get a bit higher than that, 60 kilometers a week, but it's still probably a good starting point. And then an average pace of 5:42, and the sessions there are 4 to 6 sessions a week. Now, a lot of people, in terms of when they get really developed in their marathon and their aerobic capacities, they might actually run 2 sessions in one day. If you're a recreational athlete like myself at this juncture, I wouldn't probably recommend that just yet, but that's something that people do as well regularly, so it's something that you probably need to consider long term. But essentially, when you're looking at this table, for me personally, what I do and what I'd recommend you should do is, you pick your target time, but then you should probably aim for about 10 minutes underneath that target time. And the reason why I say that, and there's a couple of different reasons why I suggest you do that. And the first is that the marathon itself, when you look at the average pace there for your particular goal time, that's an average pace over the 42 kilometers. But what we know happens and with fatigue is you tend to get slower as the marathon progresses. So what you really need to do is when you see, okay, well, I need to run a 5:42 kilometer to complete my goal time of 4 hours, is that you probably really want to be running a 5-minute kilometer or up to about 5 minutes 15 per kilometer regularly, and you sustain that pace, because as you get deep into the marathon, 30Ks, 35Ks, 40Ks, and that your average kilometers or pace per kilometer is going to drop. So that's the first thing you need to consider. And the second thing you need to consider is by giving yourself a buffer during the race as well, because things can and will go wrong. So, for instance, you may need to go to the toilet, you might fall over, you might be in the congestion of the pack as well. So it's important that you can train and give yourself a bit of a buffer in order so you can still reach that mark. But also, with this information, there also needs to be a bit of interpretation as well. So even if you did your 40, 60 kilometers per week, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do each of these sessions at 5:42 per kilometer either. There's a lot of variation in your training. So you should take these different metrics and use them as a bit of a guide, but they don't have to be all interrelated either. So again, there's a suggestion there for 4 to 6 sessions, but that might not be necessarily what you do as well. It might be 5 sessions for you, might be 3, whatever it might be. So they don't have to be all interrelate these metrics. There can be a lot of variation between the two. But what I would suggest is that no matter what your target time for the marathon, you at least try and do 30-kilometer weeks every week, because what we know and the research that I've read, particularly from individual marathon studies, is that all the people that don't complete the marathon or fail to complete it generally have low training volumes in their preparation phase. And what I've seen too often is you'll see weekly averages about 10 to 15 kilometers per week in training, which just isn't enough. So in terms of preventing injury or giving yourself the best possible chance to complete the marathon, strongly advised, and whatever, no matter what your target time is, that 30 to 60 kilometers, or so 30, 60 kilometers is probably a good base, but at least 30 is needed per week in your preparation phase to give yourself the best chance of actually completing a marathon and complete it safely. So another important part of the marathon puzzle is body composition. Now, we know a lot of successful marathon athletes have two things in common. The first one is they're not bulky, they don't carry around a lot of muscle mass, and they also carry low body fat percentage. So they're two important variables there that are imperative over the 42.2 kilometer journey. And a real basic reason for this is if you're carrying excess mass that you don't necessarily need to be, then your efficiency and the energy cost per kilometer is a lot higher than what it needs to be, which can affect your performance and essentially your race time. Now, when we actually analyze the body types and shapes, this is called somatotyping. Now, somatotyping is essentially an old school classification of the body according to your natural physique. Now, what I mean by this is I'll provide you a bit of an example. So, somatotyping here. So an ectomorph and a mesomorph, they're two common ones you see in athletes. So a mesomorph is more of your sprinter, high bulk, not bulky, but a lot of high in terms of muscle mass, still low fat mass, but carrying around considerably more than an ectomorph. So an ectomorph is someone that you associate more in terms of marathon runners. So again, low fat mass and also low muscle mass as well. So skinnier sort of athletes, but that is the ideal body type that you'd want for a marathon athlete. So the reason why I've incorporated body composition into this video is because it's a factor in the performance time of our marathon. Essentially, if we're carrying around too much or excess mass that we don't need, it decreases our running efficiency and economy and basically increases the amount of energy that we need to exert in order to carry around that mass for the 42.2 kilometers. And what we know from research as well, research backs this up. So again, looking at individual research from different marathons, we know that body fat percentage has an impact upon marathon time. And effectively, the lower our body fat percentage, the greater the greater our performance in terms of completing the marathon. Now, I'm very reluctant to provide an ideal body fat percentage number to anyone out there, just because varies too much between individuals, and what I think might be appropriate isn't appropriate for other people as well, and particularly between the two genders. So I'm very reluctant to say it as an ideal type, but what we know is the lower it is, the lower the body fat percentage, and the greater or the potential for an increased marathon performance time. And we know from previous research as well that marathon performance predictors usually are training volume, training pace, and also percentage of body fat. So that's something to keep in mind and something that you may need to work towards in order to achieve your marathon goal. What I also need to say is that body fat percentage will help increase your marathon time, but only to a particular point. So, once you get yourself to an acceptable body fat percentage, then the greater reliance upon your performance in terms of the marathon tends to come from your training volume and then your training intensity from that. So, it does definitely have a role to play. But once you get to that certain acceptable level, then it's more of an influence upon your training volume and intensity. So our penultimate discussion point surrounding the basics or the information you need to know before you complete your first marathon is limiting factors. Now, limiting factors are essentially anything that can limit our performance in terms of marathon completion. So the marathon, as I said, there's two main things that we need to consider to be our limiting factors. The first one is muscle glycogen use, or essentially glycogen and carbohydrates, and also biomechanics. So that can include our running efficiency, but also how our body handles pounding the pavement for 42.2 kilometers. So the marathon is probably one of the fewer running events worldwide that has energy use as a limiting factor, purely because of the duration of the event. Now, glycogen is the preferred source of energy for our body during exercise, but the problem with glycogen is there's only a finite amount available to us. So essentially what that means is we don't have or we potentially may not have enough glycogen to actually last us the 42.2 kilometer journey. And when we deplete glycogen in the body during exercise, this was the phrase that a lot of people have heard, and it's called hitting the wall. Essentially, hitting the wall is basically when glycogen is depleted, and we have a greater reliance towards other energy sources such as fats. But essentially, what happens is glycogen is gone, and if there's a move towards fat, there's a greater oxygen cost to actually break down and create that energy. So, with a greater oxygen cost, we slow down and our performance decreases. That's essentially what happens in terms of hitting the wall, and effectively what can derail your marathon campaign. And then the other flip side that we need to consider is actual biomechanics of running the marathons. And biomechanics, there's probably two things we need to focus on there. The first one is running technique. So essentially with our running technique, we need to make it as efficient as possible, because what that can do is if we have greater economy in our running, we have greater saving of energy that we otherwise might waste if we have an inefficient running technique. So that's vital and imperative, particularly in that previous discussion in terms of losing muscle glycogen and prolonging that switch over to a predominantly fat-based energy source. And the second part of that is the actual biomechanics of the run itself. So talking about pounding the pavement for 42.2 kilometers, it's imperative that we have enough endurance and strength in our body to be able to handle the 42.2 kilometers pounding the pavement. So that's another important factor that we need to consider when running as well. It's not all just about the training and the energy in terms of the eating and all that sort of stuff. There is also that biomechanical principle that we need to make sure is both efficient and strong enough to last that 42.2 kilometers. Lastly, if you've held on for this long, I appreciate you watching to this point. So this is my bonus tips for your first marathon. So the first one is, I think this is a pretty common tip around the marathon circles, is that what you should do is, if you're serious about training for a marathon, you should go and get proper running shoes. So I mean, get fitted and the right sort of shoe for your running style. So whether that's going to a biomechanist or a podiatrist or wherever it may be. So the first step here is to buy proper running shoes. But then when you actually buy the running shoes, buy 2 pairs. So this is an old one, an oldie but a goodie. But if you buy 2 pairs of running shoes, you can use one for training, and then you can use one for your race day as well. So what you should do is you should wear both of the shoes in, and then once they're both worn in, then put the other one aside, put the other pair aside for race day. So then you still have the shoes in decent quality when you're running on race day. Because what tends to happen with shoes is that as we get the kilometers in, then they tend to wear out, and obviously the effectiveness of the shoe isn't as great. The second bonus tip is to go see a biomechanist or some running technique specialist and fix your running technique straight away. Because what can happen is, if you can fix your technique now before you get into the nitty-gritty down the line of your training sessions, is that you can save yourself a lot of energy, you can improve your economy, and you may even improve your running time as well. So that should be something I'd recommend you do early on in the piece, because then you might even get some rehab exercise that you can do to improve your biomechanics and your ability to run that 42.2 kilometers. And then the last one is to see a dietitian as well. So again, we've spoken about glycogen and the importance of being able to effectively use energy in the 42.2 kilometer journey. So I'd recommend you go see a sports dietitian or a qualified dietitian or nutritionist in order to effectively plan your nutrition and hydration for a marathon, because it's important. It's vital for your performance there. So if you can follow those 3 bonus tips as well as the content I've shared with you in this video, I think you'll be well on your way to smashing that first marathon. That's about it for the first edition of my marathon tutorial videos. If you've liked what you've seen here today, then I encourage you to subscribe and like the video. It would mean a lot. And also check out our other stuff from TRIAX Performance. We've got my video diaries essentially on my marathon journey, and also a lot of team sport related content as well, which I think is very useful for a lot of people. So I encourage you to check that out. But otherwise, I'll see you back here next time.